Hey guys, thanks for checking out Brothers of Merit. We got a good episode for you tonight. Got Mike Mottie in. He's one of my friends from church. He's a combat veteran and he's been through a good amount in his life. So tonight we wanted to talk about channeling emotions and what comes along with that. I know a lot of times when people hear the word men and man and emotions, they typically don't go in the same sentence together. We try to be real tough and we don't like to talk about things or show our emotions, or we just bottle up inside. And Brother Mike's gone through a lot of things in his life that I feel were very significant in probably forming who he is as a man, but also the things that he had to overcome. I really think you guys will be able to relate to what Mike has gone through, and some of you may be going through the same thing as we speak. So, Mike,
Thanks. Yeah, first I just want to start off by saying that it's a real honor and a privilege for me to be a part of this. So thank you for inviting me into your house to do this
absolutely,
podcast.
absolutely.
It means a lot to me. So first, we want to talk about controlling emotions. I thought about how for a really long time, it was something I was never really very good at. For the most part, I sort of wear my heart on my sleeve a lot. Sometimes people can see that as, oh, he's being vulnerable, like that's really strong of him. But sometimes it can also put you in situations that you never really intended to be in. So, a little bit about my story. I grew up in Ohio. I didn't really grow up in a quote unquote religious home. My dad's religious, but it wasn't like going to church every Sunday wasn't something that we did. So I really didn't discover my faith till I was probably in like middle school. And my friend invited me to this church camp one summer, and made a ton of friends there, and it was super cool because that's just what summer camps are. I started playing guitar for my church and being involved in the worship team there, and did that throughout high school. And a lot of people don't know that my first dream was to be a musician. I wanted to be a musician and travel the world. And then I ended up a 26-year-old, broke, and didn't really know what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And was living in Indiana at the time. And so I walked into a recruiting station.
With the United
And
States Marine Corps.
yeah, and I joined the Marines, which I was probably the weirdest looking recruit that recruiter had ever seen because I still had like gauges in my ears at the time because I was one of those emo kids.
It's so funny looking at you now, and you
I
have this
know
like
you look
8 inch beard,
right.
and then I see your pictures from your Marine Corps days, and it's like baby faced Mike, and
Yeah, you're
that's
like,
not.
who in the world is that dude? Um,
That's awesome.
yeah, so went through boot camp and all that, and ended up in 29 Palms, California. 1-7 Baker Company, and those were my guys. I still keep in really good touch with a lot of them. A lot of them are getting involved and are following what I'm doing with Task Force 112, which we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's the Marines for me was a brotherhood that I feel like I really needed at the time because I was just so super lost and had no idea what I was doing with my life. So our first deployment was an Iraq deployment, and I believe it was probably summer '08, '09, somewhere in there, and wasn't super kinetic. A lot of our seniors sort of got to take part in like the last real kinetic deployment, and we didn't really see a whole lot. We were kind of just in that sort of all the ROEs had changed at the time, and we were really just driving around waiting to get blown up. That's pretty much all we were doing. For me, it was like that's not what I signed up for. It didn't feel like what I had signed up for. I wanted to
Be outside the wire,
I
doing
want.
your
Well,
thing.
I mean, we were outside the wire, but like I wanted to. I wanted to get into it. You know what I mean? Like I wanted to see it. I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to see. I wanted to get. I wanted to see what it would take to break me. Honestly, like I wanted to see what I was made of, and it didn't really happen.
And that was
That was the first
the
deployment.
first tour, yeah.
And then we came back after that deployment, and they told us we were going on a MEU. which is Marine Expeditionary Unit. You're basically attached to the Navy, and you just sort of float around with the Navy for a while and end up in really weird countries like Singapore. And um, sorry if anyone from your country's not weird. I
If
apologize
you're
if you're
listening
from
to this.
Singapore. It's super clean, like really, really clean.
Just not
You
somewhere
can go
you
to
would have ended
jail
up
for
with.
spitting on the ground there, but yeah. And then after the Mew, we came back, and I actually got fapped out to. FAP is a term for those who aren't familiar with the military. They need to make room for the incoming boot drops that they're getting, and so they sort of kick you off the roster and go send you to do something different. And I got fapped out to TTECG, which is a exercise group. You're basically overseeing units that are going through training as they're about to deploy for a combat zone. And that for me was really where I realized how much of an impact I could really have was teaching Marines what they were going to see and how to deal with those situations.
Especially the
And
Marines that
just
had not deployed before. It was
right.
their first time.
And a lot of them were like supply units, and so
Logistics, things like
didn't
that.
they
That
didn't really have the proper tactics set up yet, and so really helping them to refine those and set concrete TTPs that they could follow was something that I thought was really cool. And I this is where I sort of reached like the first real crux of my life. And one of the things that I will say is that I got this is sort of a side tangent, but so I got married maybe like a year after I joined the Marine Corps.
before your deployment.
Before the first deployment, yeah, we got married like super quick. Her name was Jessie, and we were married for almost 10 years. And at the time, like when we got married, we didn't really know each other. And it was probably really tough on her. Me leaving like
Almost right away.
maybe like a month after we got married, and she didn't know anybody in California. So being on that first combat deployment and trying to communicate back to her as much as I possibly could was also just really stressful for the both of us,
Yeah.
and it put a lot of strain on both of us. After being at TTECG for a while, I got the idea that I wanted to stay in because I realized that I wasn't really satisfied with what my Marine Corps experience was.
Like
I
with your
felt like
first
I could
tour.
have done right. I felt like I could have done more. I felt like I could have. There's more. I felt like I wasn't done. Like I could contribute more.
So that led to your second.
So I started talking to a career planner and a buddy of mine, and I had actually talked about doing MARSOC. But you have to have, in order to sign up with MARSOC, you have to have, I think it's at least 6 years on the books.
Okay.
So it would be a 6 year, it would have been a 6 year reenlistment package. And started talking to my wife. And during this whole period of my life, my whole Marine Corps experience, I had sort of like just put God on the back burner. Like it wasn't a part of like any of the decisions
Or your daily
that I
life,
made
or
or my daily life. Yeah.
why do you think that was? Because.
Well, I think it was mainly because of who I was married to, because she was not religious in any way, and I mean it's not really her fault. Yeah, it just wasn't something that like we participated in together. And so I just sort of thought, to be the peacemaker in that situation, I'm just gonna pretend like it's not a thing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I did for a while. So this whole MARSOC thing comes up, and she starts talking to. She was a big forum person, so she would get on forums and talk to other military wives and stuff. And she starts talking to some MARSOC wives, and they start explaining sort of what those cycles look like and what they have to deal with. Um,
And MARSOC, for those that don't know, is the
it's
Marine
the
Special
special
Operations Command.
operations component of the Marine Corps. Yeah, and she basically told me straight up that she couldn't do it. She didn't want to do it. So that had to pull the plug.
How did you deal with that, knowing that it was a goal that you had in mind for your career, but your wife didn't want anything really to do with it? She didn't want you to pursue it. How did you
Yeah, it was
deal
tough.
with that?
It was really tough because I felt like it was what I was put on this planet to do. That's what I believed at the time, which is interesting. If you want to talk about, if you want to pull that into the context of controlling your emotions, sometimes your emotions can influence a calling that's not really yours. And that's what's so cool about God's insight is that His is so much clearer than yours. There's always a bigger plan than what you can see. And when you try to see it through emotions, it gets fogged.
And he knows it, and you don't. You just
Right.
have to trust him. And
Right. So yeah, I pulled the plug on the whole Marsoc thing, and I really just did it because, well, one, I didn't want to be what put her through that.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I
Because
didn't.
your wife, you
Right. I cared about her at the time and didn't want to force her to into that situation if it's something she wasn't comfortable with. So we got out, and we moved back here to Maryland, which is where we are currently.
Yep.
And things were great, kind of. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, so I started going to community college. I thought, well, most infantry people become cops, so maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll get a criminal justice degree and
Yeah.
go be a cop. Maryland is maybe the DC metro area is probably, other than probably like New York and Chicago and LA and all those like huge major cities. The DC metro area is so super competitive when it comes to law enforcement jobs. It's unreal.
Even public safety in general. I mean, firefighting just
Yeah,
it's
like
down
they'll take 1,500 applicants for three
30%. Yeah,
positions.
I know.
You're like, how do you weed people out of this process? But yeah, so I tried to do that for a couple of years, actually. And sort of had a mindset change where I was like, I put my life on the line for like 4 years in the Marine Corps, and maybe I should do something else. Maybe I should use my brain or something. I don't know
Hmm.
what my thought process there was there. I just know that like I could probably do something else. So I stopped going to Carroll. That's where I was going at the time, and got a job. I just got like a security job working in Frederick, which eventually, I moved up the chain enough to start working in like the operations center where, it was a contracting company for Fannie Mae. So we oversaw their data centers. So I got a job and just tried to do that for a while and started taking online classes for computer information systems,
Okay.
for web development and working at the same time.
Now you were still married
Yep.
during all of this.
Yep. We had sort of gotten to this place where we were just going through the motions. Like, she had a job, so she would go to work. We'd both get home around the same time. We'd eat dinner. We'd sit in front of the TV. We'd fall asleep. We'd go to bed. And that was pretty much our existence for 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years. And I'd sort of like realized that I didn't recognize who I was anymore. Mainly because the reason I say that is because I was like, if we flash back to the summer camp middle school kid who loved playing worship music, just loved being at church around people, I couldn't have been any further from that. And it was mainly because I didn't want to upset her because she was introverted, and didn't really like to go out, didn't really
Conversate and
want to be
socialize
right,
and
didn't want to socialize with people, didn't want to do any of that stuff. So, and that took a huge chunk out of me
yeah, because
because I mean,
you're
you've
not really
known
like
me
that.
long. Yeah, you've known me long enough to know that
Yeah.
that's not really who I am. So it was maybe one of the hardest conversations that I'd ever had to have with another human being was to sit her down and basically say, "Look, I don't even know who I am anymore, and it's not totally your fault, but it's because of this marriage."
How did she
Um,
take that?
not good.
Not well.
Not good. Yeah, I mean, imagine if someone else told you that.
I know you said that she wasn't big in the church and all, but what do you think was that the ultimate reason that led you to that, or was there anything else that, issues that you had going on?
I understood that I had walked away from God to be in that relationship, to be in that marriage. What's really tough is that I thought that it was me sort of being courageous and like standing up for myself and like taking me back, or whatever other cliche you want to throw in there. But the first thing that I did once we had sort of agreed to like give each other time and like separate, right?
Space. Yeah.
One of the first things that I did was we literally lived right across the street from the Westminster Crossroads campus. And so I looked for divorce care. I had a friend back in Ohio who'd gone through a divorce and recommended divorce care.
So
So
you
I
went
was
through it.
like, yeah. So that was like one of the first things that I did.
Was it beneficial?
It was beneficial, but it was also very challenging because there's one section where it talks about how, as a believer, you can't walk away from the non believer. You're not allowed to walk away from
Yeah.
that relationship. So that's sort of when I realized that, like, oh, so I kind of have to do whatever I can to repair the relationship and
And not
possibly
walk away from it.
and possibly be what brings her to Christ, which was like a punch in the stomach because I was going through all the emotions of I had just stood up for myself.
Yeah. You finally sat down,
And
had that
like,
talk, and
yeah, God was like,
put the brakes on, Mike.
yeah, you're not seeing the whole picture though. So I mustered up the courage again, and had another conversation, which was, basically, could she ever see herself being that? Being someone who wants to be
Loved by God.
in the
Allow him.
church, and yeah. And I think because she loved me, she might have thought about it for a second, but she was also a very, I mean, she knew who she was. She was a very strong-willed person. There was just too much, I think there was too much damage there that had already been done in her eyes from me, saying a lot of the things that I said, that she probably wouldn't have been able to forget it. So we got divorced. I had always really wanted kids and she didn't. So that was another thing that put a pretty huge strain on it. But thankfully, I was back in the church at Crossroads. One of the first things I did was sign up to be on the worship team because we have that whole like next step center
Yeah.
thing. I went there like probably after my very first service and filled out the little card. Jim Powell is actually the one who emailed me back and was like, "Yeah, sure, come on." Not only was I back in church, but I was back to music because I had sold all my guitar equipment after
Wow.
the whole band thing didn't work out. I got rid of all that stuff just because moving, I was in Indiana at the time. My parents came and got a lot of my stuff and took it back to Ohio. I had to be in California, for boot camp and all that stuff. And so
It was easiest just to get
it
rid
was
of it.
just easier to get rid of it. And then just never really got any musical instrumentation stuff like back
Until everything went. Until
until
everything happened.
until the marriage ended and I started really focusing on like me
Getting back to who
and
you
getting
are
back to
as
who
a
I
man,
was,
and
right. I showed up for the first sort of rehearsal with the worship team and found out that Tori, who is one of the worship leaders at our church, had also served on a worship team with a guy back in Ohio that I had been on a worship team with. So it was sort of like a really instantaneous way of God showing me that I was connected to that church in a
this is where you're meant to be.
right,
You're in the right place.
which was super awesome and super weird all at the same time. One of the things that I do want to talk about though is so right before, like maybe a couple months before Jesse and I had decided that we were going to separate was when my brother committed suicide. He was 23 and I don't know that I really processed it when it happened. So there's 6 years between me and my sister and then 6 years between her, my little brother Dustin. So there was 12 years between us. But he was amazing. We used to do this thing where like I was such a nerd. I was really into like wrestling when I was in like middle school
Like
and high school.
WWF
Yep,
and
yep, like
WCW.
WWF and WCW. And so instead of, because we didn't have a lot of money, so instead of having one of those like wrestling dummies that like all the other kids had, I used my
Used your
brother.
little brother.
Yeah, yeah, but he was,
Absolutely.
yeah, he loved it though, and that's like Man, I used to wear him out too. Like it was just, I would body slam him, and
Oh
like
yeah,
it
man.
was.
I know a brother
I'm
did the same
surprised that like
thing.
my parent, and it was on my parents' bed, and like I'm surprised that like the box springs and all that stuff like held up on my parents' beds because I would slam him, and like he would just keep coming at me, like he loved it.
Loved it.
He just wanted more. But he was super bright, and he sort of followed me when it came to music. He played bass for a lot of bands. He was really into like punk rock music, so they played a lot of punk stuff. And he had like big Liberty Spike
Oh man,
mohawk for a while. Yeah, it was cool.
reminds me of like
Um,
Good Charlotte or something. Some
yeah, yeah. He was a super rad kid, and he probably could have given a lot to the world, and for whatever reason felt like that's the only option he had. And what made it more traumatic is that he has a son, and he loved that kid. Like when I see photos of them, he super loved that kid. One of the things that is I'm not I don't have a theology degree, and I'm not a pastor by any means. So I couldn't just spit out, what the doctrine is on suicide, whether people go to heaven or not. God only knows that. But what I do know is that what suicide does is that it robs you of the ability for you to tell your story to someone else. So, what happened with my brother is tragic, and it's probably something that my family will never get over.
will never
Um,
fully
that we'll never
heal.
fully get over that. But it becomes part of our story now. It becomes part of how do we grow? How do we move past it? Um, and it's something that my sister's dealing with right now, and she's doing awesome. She's going through a recovery process of her own. I love watching her journey. I love watching how strong she's becoming. So I would say that because I've been there. There's some, you know, we'll get into some of the other stuff in a second, but I would be lying if I said that there weren't times where
The thought.
I didn't want to do exactly what he did, and maybe part of it is genetic. I don't know. It's it's possible, but thought about it, so I can't judge him for that at all. But what it does make me sad that whatever he was dealing with, he
If
felt like
that was the only
he
option.
couldn't overcome it, and that he robbed himself of an opportunity to overcome it and then use that process to help someone else. I think that if we want to talk about suicide, that is the most tragic, I think, aspect of it.
So you and I say this as a man because, like I said at the beginning, emotions aren't something that we typically try to talk about or vent to anyone. As a man, we typically try to like keep it in, deal with it ourselves. Like, what do you think were some of the stages that kind of you went through? You said that you didn't fully process it when it happened. Like, how long do you think it took you to till you fully processed it and went like acceptance of it and the grievance and all? Because I know there's men out there that are probably going through the same thing. Or have before, and maybe haven't fully recovered from it yet. So, what advice could you give and kind of
I would say that, so for me, it wasn't that I didn't really go through any sort of like denial because I know that that's like one of the stages. But when I got the phone call from my mom, I knew I knew it was real. I wasn't dreaming, and it was sort of like a very lucid moment for me because I feel like it wasn't something that just totally happened out of the dark. You know what I mean? Our family was aware that he sort of had some issues. So that when we're talking about emotions, people who are having suicidal thoughts are not gonna want to talk about them. My brother was a very strong-willed person. If you told him that he couldn't do something, he would spend the rest of his life trying to do it.
just because you told him you
Just
couldn't?
yeah, that's just the kind of person that he was. And when you have that sort of mentality, you realize that that's a thick shell to try and get through. And it was for our family. But deep down, they're looking for an opportunity. they're looking for an opportunity to get rid of all that. At least for me, that's what it came down to. I had sort of held everything that had ever happened in my life in and didn't really know what to do with it or who to give it to. And at the time, I didn't really feel like there was anybody in my life who was ready to receive it other than God. And I think it becomes really important in choosing what it is that you want to hold on to, right? Because I guess we can talk about the next situation that happened. So I had been going to Crossroads for a while, met someone, and we got engaged, and she was pregnant and then had a miscarriage and then did not want to be engaged anymore. And that to me felt like the world had sort of just been ripped right out from underneath me. It was sort of all the things that I had ever wanted in one package.
It's taken away.
Right. Someone who believed in God who also loved me. Someone who was going to have my child. And then it was just all gone. It made me really glad that I had bought a dog before all that happened. And that probably sounds really weird. But if I hadn't had Huxley, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now. Because there were moments where I wanted to end it, but I thought about thought about my dog and how he would be all by himself and be scared.
Now,
And
after all that happened, did anything else from your past then start to recirculate through your mind? Like, did the instances we just talked about, your brother's suicide and the divorce and the things through your Marines, did any of that
oh,
resurface?
it felt like everything that I had ever touched was a complete failure.
And that's
It
what that
felt
event had
the
made.
band never worked out. I didn't get to stay in the Marine Corps. A marriage didn't work out. I couldn't reach my brother. I couldn't even have a kid. It felt like everything that I had ever put any of my energy into with my whole life ended in a complete failure. And when you see it that way, you think that you're broken. You think that you're the problem, that when you touch something, it breaks. When the reality is that the world is already broken and you're just walking around in it and you're touching stuff. And it's just broken by association. Pain is a necessary part of life. And I think that's where you start. Because if you don't all the other emotions don't matter if you can't understand how to use pain in your life, because it's going to happen. It doesn't matter who
Yeah,
you are. The arrow's going to hit you when it's your time, and you have to determine how you're going to deal with that. And nobody can do that for you. I mean, not even God can determine how you're going to choose to
deal with your pain.
deal with your pain and move forward. But what happened during that whole situation was I just went to a lot of people at Crossroads and just started pouring it out to them, you know, everything that had happened, where I was at and how I was dealing with it. And
Something that was different for you because you said earlier, typically keeping
oh,
it in
absolutely.
until you
Yeah.
got to that point where you realized that I can't keep any of it in anymore.
Yeah. And just fatigue. I think one of the biggest things is when you carry pain around for so long, you just get tired of carrying
Yeah.
it. You just get to a point where you have no desire to carry it around anymore. And choosing who you share that pain and those vulnerabilities with is also very important, because you need to know when you sit down with someone and you're about to share something that has pained you and is very traumatic to you, you want to make sure that that person that you're sitting across from is ready for it. Because some people aren't. Some people are not ready for that. And it will jar them. And they're not going to be able to give you what you need back
What
if
you're
they're not
expecting
ready for it.
from the person from venting to him. Yeah.
Right. And so I went to a lot of people at the church who I had just been around long enough to know that they had also been through some stuff and that they were gonna hear what I was saying and have a different trajectory, a different course of action to take
What was going through your
than
head?
what was going through my head. Yeah, exactly. And it worked. It was a very slow moving process, and I'm probably not completely 100% healed from it just because it was a lot. But for me, the place where I get to channel most of my emotions and most of my experience when it comes to being close to God is through music.
That's your outlet.
That is,
That's your connection with him, and
yeah, it's not only is it my outlet, it's just how I feel close to him. The fact that he has given me something like that in my life that I can use to bring other people closer to him means more to me than probably anything ever will on this earth. Granted, I'm saying that because I don't have kids yet. That'll probably change. But right now, that means a lot. To be able to go through a lot of the stuff that I went through and still be allowed to talk to people in social settings and just interact with people who are thirsty for God is, I mean, if you'd asked me if this is where I was going to be at like 10 years ago, I'd have probably laughed at you. And that in and of itself is sort of painful. That at one point it was a joke to me.
what I think is cool though is that from seeking God and seeking community, that has helped you through some of the hardest things you'll probably ever go through.
Yeah. So one of the things that your goal is to build a brotherhood, right? Through this
Absolutely.
podcast. And one of the callings that I sort of realized and what I think is really cool is that I think during the retreat, God sort of spoke to both of us because that's sort of where you had your idea for the men's group for this podcast. And the Task Force 112 stuff is something I had been thinking about for a while, but on the men's retreat and interacting with veterans that were on that retreat sort of solidified it for
Your
me.
vision of what you. So let's talk
Right.
about the Task Force 112. I want these guys to really hear about what the ministry is, what you've created. I think it's an awesome outreach to other men and veterans and first responders, and I want these guys to hear about it.
Yeah. So, Task Force 112 is I don't really know what it is right now. It's not a nonprofit. It's not its own organization. Right now, it's a space. It's a space where so I created the website and all the social media stuff that ties in with that. And right now, the purpose that it's serving is exactly what it needs to serve. It's a space where guys have come in and shared their hearts and shared their vulnerabilities and just some of the stuff that they've been through, and in doing that have helped other people get through their current situations. So what it exists as right now is just a safe space for guys to be able to help one another. In the same sense that you're sort of trying to form this brotherhood, I'm trying to form this task force. So I'm trying to form a solid group of prior military, first responders, active duty, whatever, who are just willing to serve, willing to serve other people because I think and I think we've talked about this before, but the biggest disconnect, and I think the reason why the suicide rate is so high amongst those communities, is because when I was in that point, when I was at that lowest point where I absolutely could have used help, the last thing I wanted to do was look for it. So the idea behind Task Force 112 is that it's a community of servants who want to do exactly that. They want to bring it to the people who are not willing to look for it. And right now it's just me. It's just me and some guys. And hopefully it grows into what I think it can be because I think that it's something that God has given me a tremendous passion for. And I won't stop until He tells me I'm done with it.
Now, do you think you're so passionate about this because it's something you wish was there for you when you were going through these things, these significant events in your life? Something that, like you said, the last thing you wanted to do was look for help.
Yeah, and maybe that stuff was, maybe it did exist and I just didn't want to see it. Yeah, that's entirely possible. But I think that for me personally, it's just not something I can ignore anymore. So it's what I'm going to use the rest of my life to do in whatever capacity that means. So it's a community that goes through a lot of different emotions. I think when you're talking about,
Tons of emotions.
yeah, when you're talking about emotions, it's maybe the community that experiences the most emotions and never talks about any of them.
Because those are tough communities to be in, to want to talk about them.
Right.
Like you said, the rates of suicide and things like that, men and women in those fields, police, fire, military, veterans, they don't want to talk about those things or relive them a lot, I feel like, because they've already gone through it and it's hurting them, and reaching out to somebody is makes them feel too vulnerable.
Well, I think it's interesting that you chose the title channeling emotions because I think that in those communities, pain is used in the opposite regard. I think you're taught to use that pain to drive you to whatever the mission is, to make sure that the mission is successful. You're using the pain that you've experienced to ensure that that doesn't happen ever again. So you're almost using pain as a motivator in a lot of those communities. And what you don't have when you're not in those communities and when you're outside of those communities, after you get out, you don't have that anymore. So you really have no outlet for your pain and what you're going through. And it just sort of sits like a cesspool and collects, and you don't know what to do with it. For me, it was realizing that first off, that people want to hear it, especially my church and the community that exists within that church. They want to hear it. That's huge. That's maybe the first hurdle that a lot of people probably need to get over, is that there are people out there who want to hear it. Because I know for me it was that nobody, nobody wants to hear my sad sob story. Nobody cares. That's completely inaccurate. And people do care about you, whoever you are. People, there's absolutely someone who cares about you.
Absolutely. Is there anything else, any last advice you want to give to the men out there listening to this that you want them
I
to know?
would so I would just say that I know for a lot of men, being vulnerable is sort of looked at as feminine or not strong, when it's, the reality is that it's completely the opposite. I think it goes back to one of the things that Taylor said in the last podcast, actually, is that when you become vulnerable, when you bring someone else into your pain, you're forging that together, and it's creating a bond because you're allowing someone to experience that pain with you, and you both attack it together.
And that comes back to brotherhood. And that's why I'm so big on that proponent of community, is the brotherhood. And that's why I seek it, and that's why I've named the podcast after it and want it for all other men, is that the vulnerability and accountability and those things that should be exercised, they shouldn't be alone. You know what I mean? They should be with other men that are going through most likely some of the same things that you're going through or have before, that are trying to seek help. You should be there for. You know what I mean? And I said it almost in every episode that going through things alone is one of the worst things that you can do, because what happens is then there is no channeling emotions. I mean, it's everything's kept inside. You don't let it out to eventually you get to the point where you're at an all-time low, and then you start thinking things that you never would have thought of before. And I really think that God will be able to help guide every man through it if you just seek Him. If you seek Him, seek community, seek help. Everyone's there, like you said. People want to listen and want to help.
Yeah.
So,
And real quick, one of the things that we didn't really get into, if you're talking about the sort of somber end of the spectrum where it's pain and anguish, and there's also the opposite end of that spectrum, right, where there's anger and ferocity, and those are also emotions that have their place in certain situations and don't in a
And
lot of
others.
others. So you really need to understand, and this is where, this is where your spiritual walk plays a huge part, because there are times when, if you look at who David is as a person in the Bible, there are times when David is a musician, and there are times when David is a warrior. And as men, that's how we all have to walk, is that there are going to be these times in our lives where we need to be the silent shepherd and the fearless warrior. And you have to understand when God needs you to be
Each one of
each
those.
one of those.
That's a good point. Mike, thanks again, brother. We really appreciate you coming out on the show and talking with the guys about the events in your life that really caused a lot of pain. God can do amazing and mighty things for every person, even if they do not seek Him. But there is also going to be moments where you think God is not present because of the painful and significant times that you're going through in your life. And that's one thing we like to stress to people is God is always there, but He's not always going to be there to answer every question for you. He's going to give you pain. That's part of life, and we all know that. There's going to be sorrow, there's going to be depression, and you have to battle that, but He will assist you by seeking Him. You have to allow Him into your life in order to really appreciate and love what He's doing for you and what He has done for you. So, fellas, check Brother Mike out. It's Task Force 12. I will attach the link into the show description. That way you can easily find him and see what he's got going on over there. I really support what he's doing, especially since I intimately know the military and the fire service. And while I have a second, I just wanted to go ahead and thank some of the guys that took the time out to review us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts. Jeff Sexton, thanks again. Joe Glazer, Brendan D, and G Lockhart. Thanks, guys. I know everyone's time is valuable and you're choosing to listen to us. So thanks again for taking that time out. And I promise you we'll do everything here at Brothers of Merit to keep delivering material that is worthwhile to your time. So until next week, stay safe and I'll talk to you soon.